Welcome back to another Beekeeping Buddies. I'm Steven.
And I'm Luke.
We're here to talk about all things beekeeping this week. We've had some requests to cover some Beekeeping 101, and we've also had some interesting news in our upcoming In the News segment, which we're going to talk about. So we're going to have a little of both. We're going to have some basic stuff for our new beginners if you're just joining us. We're gonna sprinkle in a little of some basic stuff for you guys. And for you advanced beekeepers that might get bored with that, wait till the end. We're going to have a deep dive into some crunchy bee biology to better understand what's these upcoming vaccines and how they work and what they're going to mean for us. But first, let's talk about what's around the yard.
Yeah. It's we actually got some rain, which is kind of awesome, except that everything's going dormant now.
Yep. It's still warm, though. It's
still warm. It's unusually warm. Actually, we had record-breaking heat for this time of year.
Yep.
And
it's still going to be mid-60s to 70s this coming week.
Yep, which means I'm still feeding. They still go through about 2 gallons of sugar water, 1-to-1 sugar water, in about 40 minutes still. And I'm still going through and feeding. I've still got some light hives. I think I'm about putting together a short video on how to make fondant from honey and powdered sugar. Yeah. I'll throw that up there.
I've got an old video on making candy boards myself.
Yeah.
On the my YouTube channel.
Yeah. So I'll throw links to those in the description of these. The fondant I like because it helps. It stays together pretty well on top of the hive. It's actually the stuff that you use for like a queen plug. It's what I use for queen plugs when I'm selling a queen
for a queen cage.
For a queen cage, yeah. So you have to put something in there that they can chew through eventually, and that queen plug is.
You want some more time other than a marshmallow, mini marshmallow,
but it's got more. It's fondant. It doesn't taste very good. I've tried it before. It doesn't have the nice honey flavoring to it, nothing like that. But it works well for feeding the bees. They'll gobble it down pretty quickly. I tested some.
It was more shelf stable, right?
And it's super shelf stable.
Yeah.
And it doesn't drip down into the hive, right? And it's not going to fall into little pieces. You won't find bits of sugar through your hive. So I'll throw together a video on that. I learned it from a local beekeeper, Tom Panconen was the one that taught me how to do it. It's relatively easy. I think I'm going to get a dough mixer to do it, put it together just because.
You don't have a stand mixer?
I do have a stand mixer, but I need a little dough hook on it just
because
of the
dough
texture.
Hook? I think I have a second dough hook.
All right.
I can hook you.
All right.
You going to be insulating? When are we going to start insulating? It's November now.
I know. And usually I have my insulation on. And
how many different ways are we going to insulate?
Right now I've got 2 main ways to insulate.
We said we weren't going to build dog houses.
I have dog houses that are already built that have a frame on the inside of them. So basically for those listening, like a dog house is usually the 10R pink insulation.
2-inch pink foam.
Yeah. And then when I first started doing this, I would just use massive drills, like cement drills, the 10-inch long ones, to hold them together. And it's too much. The foam's not enough to have the consistency for a heavy wind to hold that together.
Well, our first ones is we made sort of square rings, and we glued them together, and then you could drop the rings on to the hives.
And I have a couple of those still.
I still have those.
I never took them off.
Yep.
And that's the issue.
And the ants like to build colonies in the foam.
Absolutely, yeah. And I hate ants in my hives. Steve makes fun of me for it, but man, I hate it.
Yeah, it's a thing. Yep. The guy who was apiary manager, he made some fancy versions of that, except they're sort of like for double deeps. So instead of just rings, it just slides over the entire hive. Mm-hmm. And then he's got this fancy cap that he glued up and with like a 45-degree bevel between the bottom sleeve and the top cap. Okay. It's all square. And so you can sort of just go with an inner cover and then use the foam cap as the telescoping cover outside, right? Because it's all weather tight.
The bees don't chew that up?
They haven't seemed to bother it.
Okay.
And then in spring, you take it all off and set it aside, and it's just this big rectangle. It takes up a ton of volume in your yard, but I guess if you got property, it's not that big of a scale. We just sit next to the hives out at the apiary and put a brick in the bottom of them so they don't get blown away.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe we could try to make some of those for you instead of trying to make the wall foam around a bench of like 4 or 5 hives, which you've tried in the past.
So what I found last year that worked really well was at 4-foot increments. I have the 2x4s drilled into the stands.
Yeah.
And you do have to work around them in the summer because it's not worth unscrewing each and every one of those.
I don't know that I
don't have the
if it
time
was
to
my
do it.
apiary, I would definitely be taking those off because
I don't have the time to do that.
certainly increases the physical obstacles of working hives.
I thought about paying an intern to do that, but
It's almost like you had one this year.
I did, but I had him do other stuff that was more
He
important to me. So, and then I have 1x1, I don't know what that's called, fairing strips.
It was lath strips.
Lath strips. That's
for
what they're-
plaster houses, right?
So then I screw those on, and then so that it has something, a crossbar to screw the lids on. And this year I'm just going to do a back wall and a top lid to it.
Yeah.
The bees don't understand when I drill holes in the front. When I had it, basically I had it on 3 sides. When I drill holes in the front, they didn't understand where to go.
Yeah.
And I actually found them dead in the ground, a lot of bees on the ground. So I'm going to try it this way instead and see if I can just keep the north wind off of them and then keep some of the weather off of the hives.
You got some wraps that you're going to put on them?
I have some wraps. I'm going to test the wraps. I've got like 10 hive wraps. I'll throw that on a couple of them just to see how that works. And then I have like a dog house that has an inner frame. So I took that lath strips and made like a cube.
Are you trying to insulate your already styrofoam hives or just your wooden ones?
I've done both. If you insulate the styrofoam hives, the styrofoam hives of themselves go through the winter with very limited consumption of honey.
The styrofoam hives do seem to add the insulative quality that we're looking for automatically.
Right. Yeah. And then when I just insulate on top of those, because most of my styrofoam hives are mixed with wooden ones anyway.
Yeah.
I just insulate on top of those.
Should make like the styrofoam side and the wood side.
I should. If that'd be
logistically difficult, though.
Yeah, but it'd be much more scientifically interesting.
Informative?
Informative, yeah. I did put a strip right down the middle, though. That's all my queen rearing stuff.
Yeah.
So I'll be leaning more heavily into queen rearing next year.
Goals.
Yep.
Let's take a quick minute and talk about some beekeeping 101. We're going to talk. Let's talk about what jobs we have for bees in the hive. Starting with after they're born.
Yeah. So this is for mostly for the non-beekeepers that listen to us, and then also for those of you that are just starting that need some fundamentals of what's actually going on in your hive, rather than my bees are doing work.
And for the bee presentations I've given, I have answered some of these questions before about some of the jobs the bees have, and so I know this question comes up a little, and we all hear about how many jobs there are in the hive, but if you're not really into it, you may struggle to put names with all of the jobs they do, and it turns out you can actually sort of look at a hive and determine, hey, these guys are actually currently dedicated to doing this job and only this job. It's not like
lots of people are surprised when you open a hive and all the bees don't come flying out in your face.
Yeah,
they've got jobs that they're doing, and they're really interested in doing those jobs.
And they're going to do that. It's not like they wear a bunch of hats, right? Because you hear people, well, I wear a bunch of hats at my job. So what do you do? Well, I wear a bunch of hats at my job. I kind of do a bunch of stuff. Well, there's a lot of hats to be worn in the hive, but for these guys, they're only doing one thing for typically a specific period of time. And by that I mean just after they emerge from their cell or hatch.
Now, let's be clear. Right now, we're talking about worker bees.
Worker bees.
And those are female bees that aren't a queen.
Which is like 90% of the population of the hive.
I would guess like 95 to 99.
Yeah.
So not a queen, because there's only one queen per hive, and not drones, which are the boy bees. And those we'll cover at the end, because they're real easy to cover.
Yeah.
So but we're going to start with the worker ones, because they're more interesting and more varied.
So from days 1 to 2 after you emerge, your job is to clean the cell you just came out of. And so they'll spend 1 to 2 days cleaning up their cell and the ones around them, because remember, as the queen has laid her eggs, they're laid together in a section all together, so they're all basically emerging at the same time. So.
And they have to do a good job. So like during my presentations, I tell kids, your first job after you're born is to clean your room. If you don't do a good job cleaning your room, they won't use it, and then somebody else has to be sent in. Usually you again to go clean your room again, because the queen will stick her head in there and she'll be like, "Nope, not good."
You can see if you pay attention, if you're an experienced beekeeper and you've spent some time watching a queen, you will definitely have seen her walking around looking at cells, determining whether or not she likes the cell, whether she wants to lay in it. Yeah. And it's sort of a very recognizable behavior for her. Oh, she's checking out that. Nope. Oh, there you go. So she's gonna put her butt in that one. So after that, for days 3 to 12, you're nurse bee, and basically what that means is you're going to feed the open brood worker larvae with various things, mostly royal jelly. They can secrete that themselves.
It's over a gland over the top of their eyes, actually, is where they secrete that royal jelly.
And that's fed to everybody. And then if you're wanting to raise a new queen, that queen larva is fed that exclusively. And remember that, because we're going to come back to that later when we're talking about how this new vaccine impacts the hive. So for 6 to 12 days, they'll feed that royal jelly to the bees, but the drones only will get the royal jelly for like 1 to 3 days at the start. So there's, again, some differences in the diet for all the 3 different kinds of bees within the hive. All get different amounts of that royal jelly. It's sort of important to their development. From there, you turn into a queen attendant from days 7 to 11, where you'll follow the queen around and do feeding and grooming for her.
Yeah, and the important part of the grooming actually is spreading her pheromone around. It's a calming pheromone. It's called queen mandibular pheromone. It is spread through the hive, usually through contact. And if you have ever opened a hive that doesn't have a queen, that doesn't have that pheromone in there, you have heard what's called the bees roar. They get really loud, really buzzy, and they're usually not in great moods because that they know they don't have a queen, that pheromone's not there, and they're kind of panicking.
So from days 13 to 18, they're on wax duty. So they will build cells with wax. They will repair old cells. They also start doing, those cells are used for both storing nectar and pollen in. And so when we talk about if you need to build comb, draw comb, there is a specific lifespan period, which is that 13 to 18 days, which is why young colonies always build wax better than, like your older, because it's only in that 13 to 18 days, about 2 weeks after they're born, are they really developing enough to actually make the wax off of their wax glands.
So the wax glands also there are 4 glands on the abdomen of the honeybee towards the back underneath. So it's actually kind of hard to see it, especially as a beginner. It's hard to see that gland, that wax, but you can actually, when you're comfortable and aren't too afraid of being stung, you can pick them up and look at it and flip them over. You can actually see the wax, it's little white sections that they snap
look
off.
like little tiny flakes.
They do look like tiny flakes, and they break them off and chew them up and place them. And it's really interesting. There's some really strange stuff that happens too. when you have a hive that goes queenless, but we can do that. We're gonna probably do that in a different episode because some of these jobs and these things change when that happens. But let's go to what happens after that.
So then from there, we have days 21 to 42. We're going to leave the hive and we're going to graduate to a forage bee where we leave the hive, we fly out and we do all of the things that we need to do outside the hive, coming back to the hive.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about all those things in the various worker activities coming up here next. So that's the last 2 weeks of the life cycle because if you didn't know, the average bee only lives for about 30 to 40 days in the summer before their wings wear out, and they die out in the field and don't make it back to the hive.
Yeah, the wings wear out. They get eaten by predators. They drown, fall in the water. They have a really difficult time seeing water or understanding water, so you'll often find them drowned that way. Strangely enough, I'll get calls every once in a while with somebody that's got a bee that's downed somewhere and they want to save her. It's very nice. It's a very nice thought. If you want to feed them some sugar water, they'll happily take sugar water. But usually that's kind of the end of the honeybee life cycle is being an old lady. Think the old ladies that are out there on the flowers because that's who they are. And they just work themselves to death for the betterment of the hive.
So of those worker jobs, the one that probably everybody is used to thinking about the most is the honey production, which is pretty basic, right? You go out and collect nectar from flowers. There's a lot of interesting specific biology associated with that part, which we'll sort of gloss over because this is the 101 part. We're going to dive deeper into that a little later in the other biology section. So if you're interested in that, stick around. Workers also will feed drones. Initially, the drones don't feed themselves, so they need to be fed. So that's another job that they have.
Yeah.
Worker bees, again, in that wax production phase is sort of under the activities of sort of a worker. You've graduated to a worker status. So the honeycomb building is another job that a worker will do. Of the things the workers will bring in, one was pollen. So that'll be brought in from a flyer.
So let's talk about what pollen is, because pollen is, in a sense of us, pollen is the protein source, right? I often get asked, hey, do they make this honey from pollen? And that's not the case. Pollen does not make honey. Pollen stays pollen. It is protein for the bees. It'll change into what's called bee bread later on.
Which is technically the part of the flower that's needed if you want to reproduce the flowers, right?
Pollen is the part of the flower that's needed to reproduce the flower.
So it contains genetic material from one type of flower, like the male part of the flower and the female part of the flower, and you put the two different kinds of pollen together. You put pollen from flower A onto flower B.
We're talking about the pistil and the
stamen,
pollen,
like
the
all
stamen.
the biology of plants. But the point is, the pollen is the physical thing that allows the plants to reproduce. And so the bees can go out there and pick that up and store it on pollen baskets, a special they look like little teeny tiny Velcro.
Yeah, if you ever see a honeybee on like a flower, if you look at their back legs, there'll be like yellow dots on their back legs. Yep. And that's usually their pollen baskets. Now
they'll get full of that pollen because it kind of sticks to the Velcro.
Yeah, they comb it back and they stick it to their Velcro. They comb it off of their fur because honeybees are furry. The other thing that you'll sometimes see, depending on the flower, there's some flowers that really want to make sure they get that pollen on the bee. So they smack the bee in the head with the pollen. And you'll see it kind of like all over the bee. And there'll be a spot usually on the middle of their back that they can't reach well. So you'll see some bees that are stamped with pollen. Yeah.
So they bring that up, they bring that back, and then they hand off they're little granules that kind of look like a flattened grain of rice. And they'll bring those back. And if you want to harvest pollen as a substance to eat as a person, you can put a pollen trap at the front of the hive, and they have to climb through a little opening that they can squeeze through. But when they climb through there, it knocks the pollen off of the pollen basket, and you catch that. So if you've ever eaten or ever get raw pollen, That's why it looks like little granules, is because you've just knocked those granules off the pollen baskets
after
of the bees.
the hour or so of work that they've done for the day to collect all that pollen. Now it tastes like sweet flowers. Like if you took a flower and made it, I have some in the fridge or freezer right now because it does go bad. It is a protein, but it tastes like a sweet sort of powdered flour.
Yeah,
it's a superfood. It's supposed to be really good for you, but as far as my favorite things to eat, it's not. I'd take honey over pollen.
So if you're not catching it, they'll bring that into the hive. They'll drop it off. There'll be another worker bee that picks it up and carries it to a cell to get packed. That gets mixed with some bee spit, and we're going to talk a lot about bee spit later. Turns out,
so that one actually pollen they don't. Pollen they directly place it into the cell by themselves.
Yeah,
they don't transfer that off. Nectar they'll transfer off,
nectar,
but pollen they don't.
So that gets put and packed into a cell. There's the sticky gooey stuff that gets all over your hands if you open up the hive.
Yeah, we call it bee glue.
Yeah, that's the propolis, made from tree saps, a resinous substance obtained from plants, is what it says here on the sheet. Yeah. And that contains a ton of antimicrobial and antifungal, and it's really the sort of the first line of defense for how the hive stays healthy.
Yeah, if we think about it as far as a beehive, I would call that if the hive is an organism, I'd call that the skin over the hive.
As it, just like ours, it has an important role in keeping the outside world out of the inside of us.
Yeah. And the interesting part actually about propolis is that, especially locally, the main producer of propolis for honeybees is cottonwood trees. So,
really,
for as much as I cuss cottonwood trees because I'm largely allergic to them.
Maybe that's why I got so much propolis in my hives, is because I got a bunch of cottonwoods on my property.
But yeah, the cottonwoods are the major producer of that from the buds and from breaks in the sap. They basically go and collect sap.
So they'll go out and collect that and bring that back. There are some other housekeeping jobs around the hive that they have to do. Who takes care of dead bees and bad larvae? That'd be the mortuary bee.
Yeah, the mortuary bees. The other thing that interesting they do is that they'll remove stuff. The other interesting thing that they do is they remove stuff from the hive. So one of the neatest things I ever saw as a beginning beekeeper is that I had put some very thin paper in the hive that was used. They usually use it to wrap wax, like wax foundation. And I had used it. I think I used it to separate a hive, or I don't know exactly what I used. And they were chewing it up and taking it out. And this piece of wax paper kind of came out of the hive. I wasn't paying too much attention, and all of a sudden it floated up into the air. It's about 1 inch square. Floated up into the air and lightly, gently floated away, but not. It was a windless day, right?
Yeah.
So it was. And you look real close. There's this honeybee attached to this piece of paper that was taking it out of the hive and carrying it away.
We've all seen bees on a hot day out front with their butts in the air, with the noise of their wings, and they're fanning. So they're actively moving air through the hive to evaporate water, which is the primary way that they cool the hive.
Yeah, it's like a swamp cooler. So evaporation is a cooling process, and that's what they're doing there. They actually will have an input and output usually in that hive, and they'll flow air through the hive, through the frames as well.
And as we were evaporating the water has to come from somewhere. So there are bees that go out and get water. So the water carriers.
Yeah, I think that one's pretty funny. A lot of my bees are near a blacksmith studio, and they love the high, rusty, irony water off of the.
I've heard, there's always stories about people who are like, hey, I put out fresh water every day for my bees, and they ignore it. And that nasty mud puddle over there.
Oh yeah,
they always go back to that every time, and I can't get them to come to my nice clean water. And it's like, guys, it's just that's the water source they like.
Swimming pools, they will fight you to get that small leak off of that pump off of your swimming pool pump.
And the last but not least, we all know these bees. Every time you open up the hive or get near a hive, the ones that primarily will sting you are the guard bees.
Yeah, and the guard bees, I think I was actually with Steve the first time I actually noticed a garter bee, and I pointed at it, and it nailed me in the tip of my finger.
Like she was poking her head out I have some upper entrances I run in my telescoping covers, and she was poking her head out and he was like, "Hey, what's the deal with that one?" And he was like looking at her, and he got the finger too close and flew out of the hive. Bam, nailed the finger.
Yeah, I don't know if she even flew. I was real close. She jumped, and it's surprising how fast a bee can sting you, make you cry.
And I tell you what, the older those are, I swear, the older they are, the more spicy the stings are.
And and the tip of your finger has a lot of nerve endings in there. That is that I've been stung in the tip of the finger a few times, especially underneath the fingernail, and that brings tears to a grown man's eyes.
So that's sort of like episode 1 of our Beekeeping 101. We're talking about some jobs and some background of the bees. I think now we're going to transition to our In the News segment, and we want to talk about this article from November's ABJ, American Bee Journal.
Well, let's cover what's happening real local first. So we've got the ISBA.
Oh, yeah. ISBA, the Illinois State Beekeeping Association, is having their annual meeting.
Or fall meeting. I think they have a spring and a fall one.
Oh, is this the one where they elect officers too?
This is the one where they elect officers.
Right,
I will not be running as an officer.
Yeah, that's what you think.
I will not be running as an officer. One, because I don't think I'm effectively a member. But they'll have Bob Benny there, who many YouTube beekeepers will know. He's a real calm Southern fella and really knowledgeable about honeybees and puts out a lot of information. He's in charge of Benny's Bees. That's
usually in the St. Louis, Springfield, Illinois area.
Yeah, this is where we'll have
in the
that.
fall.
But,
and if you're interested in attending that, you need to have looked that up prior to now. They have some events that go on for the Friday beforehand. This year, they were going to do a teaching session on becoming a honey judge, how to judge honey.
Yeah, that one's sold out.
So if you were interested in some of the events that they hold for their annual fall meeting, check them out and get signed up for that stuff before the start of November, because it'll fill up and then you can't get a ticket, and it's kind of pricey.
Yeah, I think it's $80 this year if you're going to enter. No, if you're not going to enter your honey, and $90 if you do enter your honey into their honey testing.
They have a prize for first place?
They do. But I still bought the $80 one just because
you got some good honey.
I do have some good honey. I have some nice clear honey.
And
but the process for clarifying it is...
It's my understanding that the guys that win, filter it a bunch.
You filter it twice. I filter mine. The stuff I enter, I filter it twice, and I heat it.
Yeah.
And then make sure after I've heated, you have to wash the jar very carefully. Yeah. And then after washing the jar, you only handle it with cotton gloves. And
you don't have a fluoroscope, do you?
I don't have a fluoroscope. A fluoroscope is a light that you put your honey in front of to see all of the debris that's in the honey.
So you can see pollen and lint and cat hair and
everything
all
else
kinds of stuff
that's into your honey. And the winners are real picky about that. So, no, I don't have a fluoroscope, and no, I don't usually enter my honey. Although 1 year, I think last year, definitely last year, somebody that I've spent a lot of time talking to, I think she listens to the show too, she won first place as far as honey goes. So if Bully Bee Apiary is the name of their apiary.
I thought Roland had a prize at
Roland won what's called the black jar honey, and that you put in honey and it is for flavor. They don't look at it at all. But Bully Bee Apiary, they won first place.
I mean, come on. Would you like to have the one that looks the best or tastes the best? Let's be honest here.
Well, I've had some good tasting honey that didn't look good.
Yeah.
And I've had some good looking honey that didn't taste good. So it's...
I mean, to me, it's about what it tastes like, man.
Yeah.
I'll take the taste best win.
I don't know. There's some of the stuff that's real cloudy or crunchy, like it's starting to crystallize off the bottom.
I am not a fan of that mouthfeel. That's for sure. We've talked about that before.
Yep. And all honey crystallizes, by the way. For those listening and they're like, oh no, my honey never crystallizes. Yeah, it does. All honey crystallizes unless you heat the heck out of it, and then it's not really honey. You got kind of sugar water stuff there.
So the other thing we're going to touch on briefly in this segment is this article about a vaccine that's being developed for AFB. Dallin Animal Health is the company that has been working on developing this vaccine for AFB. And much like most of the drugs and vaccines that we develop, you have to tell the certifying body what you want your drug to be certified for or vaccine to be certified for. And so when you tell, in this case, the USDA, I'm going to be doing a test to determine whether or not this procedure or vaccine is useful for AFB, then they will tell you to proceed or whatever that process is. And at the end, if you're successful with your data, they will give you the rubber stamp that says you have developed a vaccine for AFB. Now, along the way, if you have a bunch of other benefits that crop up out of that, like maybe it's really good at controlling EFB or really good at controlling deformed wing virus.
Yeah, EFB is European foul brood. AFB is American foul brood.
Then you don't get to put that on any of your marketing materials because you officially didn't request at the front end to have it tested.
Yeah, it's not just I'm going to have this drug and I don't know what it'll cover yet, but I'll tell you at the end.
I'll tell you at the end, right?
It doesn't work like that.
So this article is hinting at some positive results associated with how that AFB vaccine has been impacting, and by impacting I mean helping kill off both EFB and deformed wing virus.
I don't know if it helps prevent it.
Yeah.
Helping prevent those diseases, those viruses. I'm trying to, I took a minute to think about
EFB is a bacteria.
EFB is a bacteria. So helping the occurrence of those be less in a hive.
And so the short version is they are going to be resubmitting a new claim to the USDA in 2025 for additional coverage for other like EFB and potentially deformed wing virus, but that still remains a bit mysterious as to why this is impacting them.
And not mysterious as in it's magical, right? It's mysterious. We don't understand why. It works.
Because again, this is a bacterial issue that is having a negative, right? It's negatively impacting. It's reducing the levels of deformed wing virus, which is a virus. Which, remember, from our biology, viruses are different from bacteria. But
let's take a quick. Let's review what foul brood is real quick. Just real quick.
Okay.
So like AFB, right? AFB is a spore that causes a bacterial infection, and in bees, it basically melts the larva of a bee, and the fix for it currently is to burn your beehive. You dig a hole, you light a fire, and you burn the hive with all the bees in it, because it's a spore and it's very virulent in that it spreads easily, and you don't want that around the U.S. EFB,
the European version, also is in the U.S., is not a spore. It is a bacteria. Well, it's not a spore as in a spore that sticks around for forever, which is why you have to burn the AFB one. It is a bacterial infection of the hive, and that bacterial infection can be treated with antibiotics, although both Steve and I have tried treating ours. We've had ones with EFB in it. We've tried treating with the antibiotics, and it's not terribly effective from our experience. However, the typical application for the antibiotic is done through the same method that they are using to introduce the vaccine to the hive also, which is the method of transmission is through a treated piece of candy, so
Right.
sugar.
So ours was the way you treat bacteria.
So the way we
treat
mixed,
it is sugar.
yeah,
Powdered sugar
we
mixed
mixed
with,
the antibacterial powder with powdered sugar.
right.
So they consume that in their digestive tract, and then they end up spreading that because they end up using bee spit in a lot of their stuff, which is why we talked about some of the earlier jobs. And I think we're going to dive into, this is the portion where we'll dive into that deeper here at the end, where we talk about some biology so we can better understand how the whole system works.
Right. And then I wasn't successful in treating mine. I ended up actually getting rid of all of that equipment and starting over. And I think eventually you also were not successful and ended up getting rid of your.
That, or they just didn't make it through the winter and they died, and then I chose not to reuse that woodenware.
Yeah, and that's what I ended up doing. And so anyway,
And you know, our state inspector, Illinois, has state inspectors, and our state inspector has told us several times over the years that he has had various sites he's visited that have treated with antibiotics in order to suppress the EFB. And his question of, hey, what happens if you stop treating with the antibiotic? And they're like, well, our colonies have a tendency to collapse. Then he's like, oh, so you still have the EFB around? You're just essentially suppressing it with the antibiotic.
right. Which
So
is
again,
not worth.
and that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about developing a vaccine that can be given and spread throughout the hive, ongoing throughout the hive, based on the way that the bees transmit their biology and immune system works through mainly their gut health, and by the feeding of both the queen, because the queen doesn't feed herself, she's fed by the worker bees, and also how the worker bees feed the larvae. So because of that, that's how they perpetually
the attendants.
Yeah.
So the way that they inoculate the queen is by feeding the attendants inoculated sugar with that has inactivated, and I'm gonna stumble over this word, Paeanibacillus larva, which is the bacteria that causes American foul brood. And that larva, remember I said it is a spore that just turns into a larva that then impacts the bees. So they've inactivated this larva, they mix it in sugar, they feed it to the worker bees that are the queen attendants. Remember we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, they have queen attendants. Those queen attendants then feed it to the queen bee, and because of this inoculation, they are then resistant to AFB. Originally, their goal was AFB, but now they're resistant to EFB and deformed wing virus.
So we look like they are going to be offering queens for sale that are going to have be inoculated, and also come with VHS, which is the Varroa sensitive hygiene, which is, if you're looking for hives that are better at managing their mite loads without having a lot of intervention from the beekeeper, from us, then there are some people that are leaning heavily into that and feel like they can move away from doing external treatments of the hives with VHS queens. VSH.
Yeah. So Varroa sensitive hygiene. Now, that, and I think that's actually, personally, that's the future of beekeeping, is to encourage and have more VSH gene expression, but it is a recessive trait. And until we have our major beekeepers, which is our pollinators, right? Because realistically, I don't know if many people know, but about 90% or more of all honeybees in the United States are owned by basically 5 or 6 farms. And as a backyard beekeeper, right, even if I have 70 hives, that is nothing. That is not even a drop in the bucket
I mean,
compared to
the
hives.
commercial guys are running tens of thousands of hives.
Right, and that's who owns most of your bees, and that's where most of your bees come from in the spring. That's where those packages of bees come from. That's where nukes come from. All of that stuff in the spring, it comes from those guys. So until those guys actually start inoculating and doing this, and then raising for VSH, fluorosensitive hygiene, then you're not going to have a major push across the U.S. I just don't think it's sustainable just because it's a recessive gene.
We probably should talk about our Honeybee Hotline when we answer questions that we've received from people that give us calls or text messages. This week, Luke, I think did you mention your guy who had
He had a hive that collapsed in the summer.
Was it this summer or
this summer?
August or what? What's this summer?
As far as having the hive, I think he started in end of June, which is a tough time to start for beekeeping.
Sure, that's it's
so he had to
kind of behind the curve there, but
feed the heck out of them, and then he treated in August with Formic Pro because his mite count was higher than I think we had a mite count of 6 or 7, and so my mite count, that time of year, into July, you should have a mite count around 3 is what I like to see. So he treated with Formic Pro, and then we had a little heat spike there, and I think that he still treated during that heat spike, and the off-gassing of that Formic Pro above 85 degrees Fahrenheit can be pretty rough on queens, and you can kill queens. They have warnings on the thing.
I was going to say that's all per manufacturer's recommendations in terms of allowable temperature range for the use of that product. So, this isn't our opinion here. This is directly from their published information.
Yeah. So I think that it got treated during that time frame and smoked the queen, and they didn't requeen well, and they collapsed. Now, they had some really strange looking brood there, and so I took a sample using a Q-tip and sent it into the bee lab. It cost me a total of $5 for shipping to get that tested for AFB and EFB, and it had neither of those. So to me, it says mite load was high, probably smoked the queen, probably killed the queen, probably hive collapsed after that, didn't requeen well, and then all of a sudden you don't have, you didn't check it for a month, and you have a dead hive.
Well, the thing that strikes me most about that is some of the presentations we've had on varroa mite infestations have had slides that have shown a really sprouty brood and dead slumped larvae, and if you didn't tell me the difference, if you put the slide up there and you said this is EFB, I'd go okay. And if you put that slide up there and you went, this is parasitic mite syndrome, I'd have went, okay. How do you tell the difference? And you're like, you don't. Yeah. They look basically identical.
You get a testing kit out and test it.
The only way you're going to tell is, do you have a high mite counts? Yes. Okay. And have you been tested for EFB? And if you have been tested for EFB and it comes back negative and you got high mite counts, you get PSB, but like PMS. So the reality there is they look identical. Like I can't tell the difference between the two. I've had both, and I know that I've had both because I've come up tested positive for EFB, and I've also seen deformed wing virus, which is usually the late stages of parasitic mite syndrome.
Right.
So, not being able to even if
deformed wing virus is its own virus, but it expresses more when you have. When you have
at the tail end of
parasitic mite syndrome.
Yeah, yes. It's one of the markers of parasitic mite syndrome.
Yeah, it shows up, they're both spread by mites.
And so, when you say you've got spotty brood and you've got weird looking malformed larvae there, then you've got issues with mites probably, and parasitic mite syndrome there.
Well, almost certainly, right?
I don't have any questions. I didn't get any questions this week. I guess I had the one guy I had call and ask about. He had right before we had we had a frost right on schedule. We got down to like a 30-degree overnight frost, and he had checked his hives the day before and left a couple supers on. I wanted to know whether or not it was okay. Like, how should he proceed? And I said, well, I'll just wait till tomorrow and pull them off. You know, one day isn't gonna make a difference for having that extra volume there. So just get in tomorrow when it's warm and pull your extra supers off that you. He had set some down on the ground, and we went to pick it up and put it all back together. He grabbed the whole stack and not remember, and then he meant to pull off the empty ones. So
I personally have done some testing over the years with extra supers on top of the hive going into winter. And I found that if I leave those supers on going into winter, the bees don't do particularly very well.
They like to have a nice, tight,
they would like
small
smaller space.
Yep.
And so those listening that are like, well, I'll just leave supers on going into winter, or I've checked them into July and it's not quite right and I don't want to take them off and things like that. My suggestion would be take them off, reduce your space, give them a smaller space. If they need to be fed, feed the heck out of them. But I will not, going forward, I will not be keeping those supers on ever past end of spring or end of summer.
So for our last segment for Droning On, where we talk about what we're going to be doing in our coming weeks between now and our next episode, it is we're rapidly approaching the end of beekeeping season, where we do all of our off-season things, start prepping woodenware or developing classes for next year, or trying to figure out, are we growing the apiary? Are we shrinking the apiary? Are we trying to set up new sources for packages and nukes? So I think that's what we're focused on going into winter here. And we'll bring you along on that journey in terms of where we're headed and what we're doing. So I don't know that I have a lot of around the yard to add for our Droning On segment.
No, it's the main thing is getting your stuff ready for next year. So if you're a starting beekeeper, now is when I would suggest, start reading your backyard beekeeper book or Beekeeping for Dummies, and choose your equipment and go see your other beekeepers who are putting stuff away and ask them, what did you find that was useful this year? What's the good stuff? What's the bad stuff? What should I avoid? Because realistic and why, always ask why. And realistically, I think that'll benefit you greatly in your beekeeping journey in the year to come.
Well, and the holidays will be upon us, and you get busy with all that, and before you know it, it'll be January, and that's when new beginner beekeeping classes start signing up, and you got to get your package orders in if you're doing that. So
and I'll be headed this spring. I'll be headed to the Honeybee Expo. Those deals are all out right now as far as discounts for those. So
check those out.
Some of them are pretty steep discounts.
We appreciate you hanging in for this hour of Beekeeping Buddies. This is where we are going to follow the rabbit hole on some bee biology that you probably don't know about, because it was a real head scratcher to put it together in terms of stuff that we thought we understood, and looking up some information about how does, like, this is in relation to when you say you're going to give a bee a vaccine, we're not pulling each bee out of the hive and sticking them with a needle. It just doesn't work the same way.
Yeah. And they don't have the physiology that we have, right?
Right. So I'm like, I could explain how a vaccine works for us, and like how a virus gets into, like you pick up the cold virus at the store because somebody sneezes on you, and it gets in your nose, and then that gets in your blood system, and then it reproduces, but then you've got white blood cells and macrophages that go and attack that and clean it up, and then it gets flushed out of your system, your bloodstream, through your kidneys, and eventually it leaves out of you. And, that's the whole life cycle of that virus. But bees don't have a circulatory system. They don't have white blood cells.
Certainly not like ours, right?
No, not like ours.
They have hemolymph.
Yeah, but
it's not blood.
And we don't have blood vessels, right? We don't have kidneys.
Right.
There's a lot of parallels. They have equivalent processes, but it's an entirely different,
Totally different system.
totally different system. So like, you're like, well, you'll just give them a vaccine. It just doesn't work the same way. So what we've done is we've went in and tried to break down how this actually works for in the bee biology.
How well we broke down like what the immune system is, and to be fair, we did some really Scientific Beekeeping has a paper that I remembered from like 2010 that it does a really good deep dive in it. So what we talked to you about today, if you're looking for some more deep diving,
I'm like, yeah, we're not
we are not the
entomologists, and this is not like an insect bee biology course that you're going to cover for 3 months in school.
Yeah,
or you're going to get 20 minutes of down the rabbit hole.
Right, and
so buckle up.
If you're looking, and if you're looking for that information, I highly recommend.
It's out there.
I highly recommend the website Scientific Beekeeping. He's a great in it. But we're going to do the best we can, and we're going to bring you along.
So it kind of starts with an exoskeleton, which is the outside crunchy part of the bee, but that doesn't exist in the form that we know it as a developed bee, because there's the pupa stage when it's sort of soft and squishy. But the point is, that's the first line of defense to the exterior world if you don't count the propolis skin that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. So the propolis skin is kind of the inside of the hive, and they'll coat everything on the inside of that hive. Varies. It actually very depends on the bees. But some will really coat everything, and some will mostly coat everything on the inside of that hive.
But it's also a mechanical, like they're producing it, they're carrying it around on them, with them, right? So like the antimicrobial, antibacterial properties of that, like it's a physical substance that they're carrying around and have on them or interact with, right? So it's sort of the first line of defense in terms of, for lack of a better analogy, the sort of the washing of the hands, right? Like that's the mechanical portion of how we're going to interact with the viruses of the world to keep them out of us out of the bees or out of the hive.
Yeah. And then I would say the next one actually is how they gather their food, all right? Because a bee that goes out in the field,
it interacts with the world where the viruses exist and bacteria exist.
Yeah, and if it gets out there, or the toxins.
Yep.
And if it gets out there in an area, so say it gets sprayed with pesticide, that bee just doesn't come back, right? It dies. So that's for really lethal stuff. Hey, you don't make it back home, you can't spread it back here, you're dead, right? It's kind of like I've always said that the foragers are kind of like fingers, but I don't even know if it's that. It's they just don't make it home. And that keeps the really, really dangerous stuff out.
So there'll be a recurring theme throughout this where Mother Nature's like, hey, at some point, like the best defense is just to cull it and get rid of it, right? Just chop it off, exile it, kill it, get rid of it, and then I can save the part that isn't the problem.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of a recurring theme throughout this of that sort of method. So that's sort of line of defense one. It's something really nasty. It dies out there. It never makes it back. It gets cold out in the field and it never makes it back. But if it's something that is not sort of bad enough to kill you on the spot, you'll bring that back. So the first thing is, if you suck up nectar and the nectar's contaminated with dust, or what was the other things that was filtering out?
Dust or pollen or
I thought it was also other
viruses.
Yeah,
or not viruses, but bacteria.
Yeah, and so they're the organs that they use to ingest that nectar have teeny tiny. They're like almost like the baleen on a whale, right? Like it filters. They suck that up and through essentially a filter internally as they suck that up, and that filter acts so that the only thing that they bring in is super clean and store inside in their honey stomach.
Yeah, so that is called the proventriculus. So we did look that up. Pre-stomach is what it means, in front of stomach.
And so that's again sort of a mechanical defense on making it clean and keeping the bad stuff out in the environment.
Yeah, and then they dose that nectar that they have in them with enzymes. And
Bee spit. We're gonna refer to it as bee spit a lot of times.
But it is enzymes, and that enzyme and some lactic acids, and that causes the production of hydrogen peroxide, naturally occurring hydrogen peroxide.
Chemical reactions with the enzymes and the nectar. So basically, when the bees spit on it, good things happen.
Yeah.
Let's to boil it down.
Real simple.
The bees spit on it.
The enzymes is real good for killing stuff.
Yes, real good for killing stuff. Yeah. And so they're going to put bee spit into the nectar, and then they're going to bring that back to the hive, and they're going to regurgitate that.
Past their filter,
and that doesn't get fed directly to the most
susceptible of the honeybees
of the hive. It first goes to
the mid foragers, or they call them the mediator bees,
and they're, for lack of a better term, they're the food testers. Remember the guy who eats the food tests the food for the king? Because if it's poison, then the food tester dies off before the king does. This is exactly their job.
Yeah, and so they're not the old bees. They are the middle-aged bees. So the foragers are old. These are the middle-aged bees. And these food testers basically get nectar from the older bees that's been filtered, and then they'll actually do that again. They'll pass that and pass that around. And
so it's literally the food testers, and again, the mechanical. If you die, it makes you sick, then we're not going to pass it on. We're going to cull it. We're going to get rid of it. It never makes it into the hive where the most vulnerable portions of our brood are currently being raised.
Right. Where yes, exactly. Where our young bees are, right? Because if you get it down into the young bees, it spreads through the hive, and then you're in trouble. And
so again, like why is this important? Because this is fundamentally all parts of what keeps the hive healthy. This is functionally their immune system on a macroscopic scale. It's just not white blood cells inside their circulatory system, right? You got to understand that it's this entire system that we're talking about is acting as their immune system to keep them healthy.
Yeah, and we're glossing over, there are some smaller integral things that happen they have 3 guts. They have a foregut, a midgut, and a final gut. So those things, we're kind of glossing over those details, but they also have things that happen in there that we're not covering that further the immune response that's on a personal level on the bees. So yes, we're talking about these bigger things. However, there's some smaller things that happen as well.
So to sum it up, we've got the exterior exoskeleton of the bee. That's sort of the physical line of defense, like our skin keeps the outside world on the outside.
Yep.
And why that is important is because the varroa mite actually bites through and leaves a hole in their exoskeleton.
Yeah.
And that exoskeleton is never actually repaired with the keratin that it was actually built with from scratch. They don't shed a shell like a scorpion right? So what they have, what they emerge out of the cell with is what they have for their entire life. However, they can patch the hole that's left.
Yeah, they scab over it.
Yeah, so they're not hemoglobin. It's
hematin, I believe. But it is a part of their hemoglobin.
They're essentially their blood, which is actually called hemolymph, will ooze out and form, for lack of a better term, there's a fancy term for it, but you can think of it as a scab. And that scab will eventually sort of crust over and become hard, but not as hard as the original keratin that made up the exoskeleton.
Yeah, the chitin.
The chitin. So yes, that is the first line of defense, and that was why the varroa mites, when they bite into our bees, it's a problem for them. They're also bringing with them, when the varroa mite bites, you know how we get infected with malaria? The mosquito bites us, and then
or the plague.
Or,
the plague did the same thing with fleas.
Yeah. So when the blood-sucking parasite attaches to us, the blood exchange is not just one way, right? They just don't suck our blood out. A teeny tiny amount may flow into us at some point, and that infected bad stuff will come into us when that happens.
So with varroa mites, they actually inject a digestive into the bee.
Yeah.
That breaks down the fat body.
And that comes with it a very specific strain of deformed wing virus, DWV. Yeah. And there are, in fact, 3 types in the article listed as A, B, and C.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear about this part.
And
we just talk about DWV.
DWV, and there's actually 3. It's like probably saying that, there's a bunch of different types of cold or COVID, right? Like there was COVID-19, and then what different kind of COVID did you have this year? So again, it's the same for DWV, and what they're seeing is the B type is most prevalent because the B type is most proliferate inside the mite. So the B type grows most effectively inside the mite system. And so when the mite bites both the larva or an adult bee, but typically a larva, because the mite is in the cell, in the cocoon with the larva, when the original mother mite bites the larva, it will inject the larva with a sort of a superdose of DWVB.
Not on purpose, but just as part of their
just
liquid exchange.
Yeah. And so when you get that super high dose of the deformed wing virus, that is what is crippling to the development of that larva coming out of the cell. And so,
which means, so here's the interesting thing. The high dose is crippling. The low dose still gives that bee deformed wing virus. It just doesn't express.
It's also spread throughout the hive, most commonly through tropophylaxis.
Yeah, which is basically swapping nectar between bees.
Which is
bee spit nectar.
The nurse bees feeding larvae, right? So when we said, remember how we said that the nurse bees will physically, puke the food onto the larva, right? So the reason why we talked about the biology of how the bee spit works is because this comes up with how viruses and bacteria are spread throughout the hive into larvae, is because all the feeding is done by basically spitting and puking on stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's through the honey crop, so they have 2 stomachs. This isn't their digestive stomach. They have a secondary stomach called the honey crop, but it still is. I had a friend that just sent me a T-shirt that says, "Honey is bee puke," which I thought's funny, but kind of fitting for this podcast. So,
and so now that we sort of laid that groundwork, now we're going to talk about that we've done all that so that when we say we're going to give you a vaccine, how are we going to actually administer the vaccine? And the way they do that is how we touched on earlier, where we're going to intentionally, the word is not infect, but
inoculate.
And intentionally inoculate some a sugar, like a sugar patty, right? A sugar block,
Fondant is usually how they do it. But yeah, they're going to inoculate a fondant with the dead portions of the specific AFB. with the specific
The
AFB again is
P,
that
the P larva bacterium.
yeah, Pennybaculus larva.
Yeah.
Which is the stuff that causes AFB.
And so because that's mixed into the bee candy, the bees ingest the candy, and then the vaccine is delivered to the queens as they're fed by nurse bees.
Yeah. So the queen, if we didn't cover before, queen doesn't feed herself. Usually. She can.
We talked about that.
She can, but she doesn't usually. And then the nurse bees that are with her will feed her and take care of all of her needs.
Which is why, again, we sort of started with a Beekeeping 101 where we talked about, hey, the nurse bees and the queen attendants as the two jobs they had from days 3 to 12 and days 7 to 11. So some callbacks to the earlier in the show. We kind of planned this to kind of try to pull it all together here at the end.
Yeah.
So the nurse bees are feeding the queen, and that's how she becomes vaccinated. And then because she is touching and interacting with the eggs, and the nurse bees are basically taking the beneficial larva, the beneficial saliva that they have. Remember that the bees have got the glucose oxate in their spit, their saliva, right? And that's what's part of that, again, part of the immune system that they're using to basically kill off bacteria and microbes that they interact with. So it has a lot to do with bee spit and how they ingest the food and then they carry it over and give it to both the queen and the new brood. And after all this is said and done, the point is that once you have queen and the new larva is inoculated with the bacterium, the beneficial bacterium, they're able to identify the AFB, the bacteria, as problematic, and
so that's translated. So that's translated by antimicrobial peptides.
Yeah,
which is an induced response from honeybees. So that response can be transferred through gut health, giving nestmates resistance to before they're basically they spread the vaccine.
Yeah, in short. And so once you have a reduced chance of suffering from AFB and DWV, their chances of overwintering are much better. Now, the kicker here is all of this process only works for the active queen and the active workers, the workers that were currently being raised, because it's not actually passed from the mother queen to a daughter queen, and that's because we only feed the daughter queen with royal jelly, which is not the same substance as being that has been.
It's not the bee spit.
Not been treated.
It's a processed chemical, processed food source
that they produce themselves, and doesn't come from the candy that contains the vaccine that they've chewed up and processed internally
and put into their gut health.
Which is
those peptides that are then transferred from bee to bee.
So again, that's the stick the needle in the bee equivalent here is them eating a sugar candy that has had the vaccine inoculated into it, and then them through their gut health basically regurgitating and spitting on all of the things that they do, both the nectar and
that includes those peptides. Yeah. So the other interesting thing here is that we've talked about before is that varroa mites eat the fat body, and these antimicrobial peptides are actually produced by the fat body of the honeybee. So your immune response is decreased when you are starved of protein, which also makes up the fat body for the bees, and or being fed on by varroa mites. So it's like it's a terrible cycle that feeds upon itself, right? The mites are eating the fat bodies and spreading deformed wing virus, which is fought by the fat body, which has been eaten by
the
mites.
And it's sort of a human analogy here is if you're immunocompromised, where your body's not making white blood cells, it cannot fight off an infection. The equivalent here in bees is the part of the immune system that's actively fighting is the fat body of the bee is
that's making the peptides.
Is working on actively trying to fight stuff inside, and as the varroa mite eats that away, sucks that away, it reduces that size, which means it reduces the immune response ability of an individual bee, and then it gets sick and dies. The overall, and then the mite falls off and finds a healthy bee with a nice fat body on it and latches on, and the cycle starts over again. And this is how your hive goes from a healthy booming one in spring to a collapsed one in late summer.
Yeah, and this goes hand in hand with the huge logarithmic growth of varroa mites in a hive, particularly if they can't regulate those mites. So it's a really interesting, bizarre cycle. Now, the other thing that was really neat in this whole study was the I don't know part.
Yeah,
I'm a big fan of when beekeepers or not, like just people, say, hey, this thing happens, and we know it happens, and we've measured that it happens, but we don't know why. And then
they talk about that, right? The why that causes a reduction in DWV remains a bit mysterious.
Yeah. So this is in your American Bee Journal if you want to read that. Now, does it go into the in-depth immunobiology of a honeybee?
No,
no,
because it's sort of assumed that, right? And really, that's sort of aside from the fact that this is just an article talking about, hey, new thing is out there, and you can go out and buy a vial of this for about $45, and it'll treat something like 50 queens. So, like, the whole point of the article was just say, hey, this is available. But when you read that as a beekeeper, you're like, okay. My first question was, yeah, but how does it actually work, right? And you tell people, hey, I got a vaccine for my bees, and they're going to kind of look at you and you're like, You're sticking them with a needle. How do you stick them with a needle? How do you stick 50,000 bees with a needle?
Which was our first question when we were talking to each other. I thought, I don't remember. I remember that there's been studies done on this, but I didn't remember how it was done. Right? Like maybe you gas them, because that's what oxalic acid is. You gas them. Is that a vaccine? No, that has a chemical reaction with the.
It's an external
varroa mites on the bees, and we don't have a good understanding of why vaporized oxalic acid actually melts mites. So there's a bunch of stuff in beekeeping world. This is probably why it's so fascinating for me that we don't know, right? And there's stuff that we learn all the time, and that's probably.
And again, this is all cutting edge. Like, this isn't years ago we figured this out and it's just coming back to light. Like, there's cyclical trends in beekeeping. This is not one of those. This has been developed in 2023, and we're just publishing the research and making the vaccine available for purchase like today, right? Like this quarter of this year.
Yeah.
And we'll have more.
And the vaccine is actually still for AFB.
It's only like per USDA, it's only for
AFB.
AFBA, because again, when we started out earlier talking about, hey, what did we register with the USDA that this is going to be effective with? We only wrote down on the page AFB, but we're like I said, the article talks about how we're going to go back and resubmit a new claim to the USDA for both EFB and DWB, the deformed wing virus.
Yeah, deformed wing virus, A, B, and C, right? But B right now is the most.
B is the biggest issue because it's
not as a beekeeper. Like I couldn't go to a hive and go, no, this one has DWB-C. That's exciting. No.
And as a quick side note, you're like, hey, how do we know which of the deformed wing virus it is? And it turns out that you'll take your bee sample and, for lack of a better term, blend it up and take your soup and then pass that through a PSR.
Yeah, PCR. qPCR, which is and then analyze the DNA.
Basically look at how much DNA of my sample, my blended up sample, corresponds to what is known as the B type of the deformed wing virus. And so that because they're like, hey, we had a 90% drop in virus level. So actually, the quote from the article here: 4 months after vaccination, DWV-B viral loads were 90% lower in vaccinated colonies than unvaccinated colonies. You're like, well, how do you determine that? Well, you literally take a sample, you blend it up, you do your qPCR test, and you look at the actual amount of virus found in the genetic sample. And when it's 90% less than your control sample, then you can say, hey, we've had a significant reduction in the amount of virus load in this hive.
Yep.
So again, this is real science here. This isn't hand waving, right? This isn't sort of bunch of statistical, what we think, right? Like there's real science behind.
And it's applicable science is my nice, right? Like, hey, do I need to know, how the biology of a honeybee's immune system works?
Does it make you a better beekeeper?
But
to go out there and understand, hey, this is how the three stomachs of the bee work.
I think it does. Like, I think understanding how the immune system works gives you a better understanding, because you can say, oh, my bees aren't producing the royal jelly that the larvae usually sit in, right? You can see that it's dry. If you know that it's dry, you can go, oh, they're probably protein starved. Maybe not nectar starved, but almost certainly protein starved, right? Because it's protein that they're ingesting, which is that bee bread, right? Which is pollen mixed with bee spit that they're ingesting in order to make that royal jelly, in order to feed your baby bee, your larva. And then if they're protein starved, then you can take steps to actually improve the health of your hive by putting out maybe
a pollen sub. Yep.
Right? Which is,
and there's other science too, right? If the bees are known to eat eggs, because when they're super short on protein,
yeah,
because that is a known it's basically all protein.
Yeah. And they don't grow as fast if they're short on resources. And you can see hives that will lay in very small patches, and it's entirely possible that they don't have the foragers in order to grow.
And I've seen it, right? You take a small, 5 or 6 frame hive that you've been trying to watch, and you've had another hive that seems to be just bursting at the seams with foragers, and there's sort of a hump that they can't get over, right? Because they don't want to produce a ton of brood because they don't have the resources to support a ton of brood, and sort of it's you can't get the snowball rolling downhill, right? And so by just pulling out a pollen frame from the big hive and carrying it over to the small hive and putting that pollen frame in,
complete with workers.
Yeah.
Complete with workers.
Because you need the nurse bees so that the existing bees in the hive can graduate and move to foragers.
Yeah.
Boom, just an instant boost, because we've got plenty of pollen to feed all of our brood. The queen will immediately recognize that and go to laying a ton more frames, a ton more cells.
And maybe she is laying cells and they're just eating the
It could
eggs afterwards.
It could be that too, right?
But
so
the other part of that too is, if more applicable this time of year, think about what you do for your weak hives for this time of year. We do hive combines, right?
Right.
And we do hive combines because the population needs to be there at a specific threshold, not only for resource control, but for job control, for temperature control, for everything else. So, I mean, it's super fascinating, at least from my perspective, to be able to see stuff like this and go, oh, and you can connect those dots and see that the colony, the hive, really is just a super organism all by itself.
So we had a lot of fun putting this episode together. It was a little different than what we normally do. Again, it was sort of driven mainly by what our in the news segment of finding the ABJ journal, but then also getting a request to do sort of a beekeeping 101. So we're trying to mix.
Yeah, my big brother called and he listens to this when he works out. So I'm give a shout out to Jesse. So this is a little bit of appreciate you giving us some ideas. So if you are another like a beekeeper out there,
yeah,
and you have ideas like this,
and we'll try to squeeze it into another episode. We'll do another little beginner piece, and then maybe another deep dive into a different part of the hive. There's a ton of bee biology, like in our beginning beekeeping class. We try to cover a lot of it, and it seems to fly over the head because there's a ton there, and sometimes it seems like you end up missing little stuff like, they don't go to the bathroom inside the hive.
Yeah.
They got to leave.
Yeah. Or the queen,
there's only one queen in the hive.
Yeah.
Like there's some basic biology that
unless there's not, right? and that's very rare. But there's some really neat stuff. We'll try to cover that going forward.
All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Beekeeping Buddies. Remember to go out there, find your buddy to do some beekeeping with, get into your hives and work them. Thanks for listening.